So without further ado, I will introduce our, again, very brilliant panelists here. I guess we'll go in the order of presentation, if that makes sense. So first off, we have Hannah Sassaman. Hannah is the executive producer of People's Tech Project and policy director at Movement Alliance Project. Hannah has over 20 years of experience working at the intersection of community power and tech and media justice, and has spearheaded groundbreaking campaigns, including Cap Comcast, which helped thousands of Philadelphians win affordable internet for themselves and their communities. Next, we have Dr. Christopher Ali. Dr. Christopher Ali is the Pioneers Chair at the Telecommunications of Telecommunications at the Donald P. Belisario College of Communications over at Penn State. Chris holds a PhD in communication from Annenberg and has done extensive work in the field of broadband policy, both through policy work, such as serving on the FCC's Communication Equity and Diversity Council Working Group, as well as through his scholarly work with publications in top communications and policy journals, and with the release of his book, Farm Fresh Broadbands, The Politics of Rural Connectivity. And that wasn't a plug, but if you haven't read it, it's very good. He's my professor, so of course we conspired first. Okay, great. And next we have Revati Prasad. Dr. Prasad is the director of research and fellowships at the Benton Institute, where she leads research work and manages the Opportunity Fund to support scholars, practitioners, and advocates doing critical research about the future of broadband. Revati holds a PhD in communication from Annenberg, was an American Council for Learned Society's Leading Edge Fellow at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and has published work in top communication journals as well. And last off, we have Sascha Meinrath. Sascha Meinrath is the Palmer Chair in Telecommunications at the Donald P. Belisario College of Communications over at Penn State. We're well represented here. Sascha is the founder of XLab, a future-focused technology policy and innovation think tank, as well as Open Technology Institute, which he ran while serving as the vice president of the New America Foundation.
Don't hold it against me.
Sascha's work focuses largely on broadband connectivity, and he's at the forefront of many DC policy debates surrounding these issues. Okay, so without further ado, I think I will hand it over to Hannah to get us started. Yeah.
Can people hear me okay, just sitting right here? Do I need to use the microphone? Can I just talk like this? Oh, wait, this is good? Yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much to Victor, David, Sydney, to Breyer, to everyone for inviting me to join today. And I really appreciate the framing of these conversations that we'll be having this morning and throughout the day. Just a little bit more about me. Like that was there's a few more things I will add to my bio. I'm not the executive producer, but I'm the executive director of a group called People's Tech Project, which came out of a life that I've been very grateful to live at the intersection of technology, race, and inequality, like organizing here, both in Philadelphia and in the United States. And it came out of about 11 years of work that I did with networking and community organizing shop about 30 blocks that way called Movement Alliance Project. And we're now a sponsored project of MAP, which is pretty great and really exciting. And I think that I'm on this panel because I have a lot of direct experience, especially in the first part of my working life. And I got to work a lot with Sascha and Victor and a few others, building direct alternatives to corporate technology and corporate media. So I spent a lot of time building, and with Joe as well, who's right there. Hats off, and to Antoine, a couple other awesome humans in this room. Like I built radio stations around the country, low-powered ones with civil rights organizations, farm worker groups, with Sascha in Southern Illinois, with some like beautiful community media centers down there. But to sort of frame it in the context of what we're talking about today, the question, the provocation that this panel put together, which is, does municipal, and I'll add community, broadband prefigure a more democratic communications order, Or are they destined to be localized correctives to a broadband market dominated by telecom monopolies? I think we should just try to answer that question very directly. And the question for me is one of power. It's what does any prefiguring of a more democratic communication system look like without a strategy, like without a larger strategy that relates to? And an analysis as well that I think is different than when I was coming up, like 20 years ago with Joe and with Sascha, which is about the very particular and unique role that telecommunications and tech companies writ large play in sort of the governing forces of society, the special role that they play right now in helping racial capital resolve its crises and continue to move forward. And I think that it plays a unique role that if we don't pay close attention to it, any deployment of community-based broadband, of municipal broadband, any alternatives as beautiful and as powerful as they are and feel, and I have been at the birth of dozens of community radio stations, community wireless projects, part of major organizing initiatives around building municipal broadband, and I have felt that hope. I have had my hands in the wires, and unless you deploy that tool, that thinking, in the context of a larger strategy to build durable power, like it is my assessment that they are counterproductive. They are actually disorganizing. We'll have some conversation about that today. So, like, in my experience of doing that work, doing that kind of building, I've come to like a sense of, I've come to something that we have to be really clear about what the positive vision is that communities are actually looking for, that they actually want around their daily lives, around their material conditions. And so what that means is that like, I've spent a lot of time working directly with communities who've made the determination that they want alternative broadband, alternative media, alternative infrastructures, and that it's urgent enough that they want to pay attention to it and work on it. But usually the communities that are actually engaged around that are pretty small. A lot of times the process of making the media, building the technology is as liberatory and as transformative for the people actually making it, in fact more so than for the folks that it's meant to connect with and to serve. And that has to do, I think, with a condition of like where we're living now in society, which is that with the growing inequality in particular, and I'll use the United States as our example, with the growing inequality, usually animated by issues of race, immigration, and like disability, whether you're indigenous, things like that. The material conditions that people face on a daily basis, their access to housing, their access to whether or not they're gonna get picked up by the cops, their access to having like the basic building blocks of a dignified life, which are the things that make them get up in the morning. And so even when something like access to the internet, particularly affordable, reliable, durable internet, is really, really important to them, it doesn't usually rise to the level of something that organization is cohered around. And so we saw a lot of that happening in 2020 when things changed for millions of people around the country. And it meant that the community organizations that we had in the United States might have been organized to win a lot of different things, but they weren't necessarily organized to be able to win the kinds of concessions that we needed around the internet that ended up being anything more than mostly like a big kickback to Comcast and Time Warner or AT&T and things of that nature, right? And so communities continue to have that urgent need. It's more visible, it's more on the table for everyone. But the last round of broadband funding that we just got from the federal government ended up being, and Sascha, I'm sure will talk about this when he talks about how that really sort of flowered out here in Pennsylvania, where he's playing a really crucial role. I know Dr. Ali is doing the same. Like, it ended up meaning that while there have been multiple places that have visioned, let's try to build alternative internet, municipal or state-based internet, we didn't get to a place where we were able to actually structurally challenge how the distribution of the resources coming from the federal government did anything more than provide a massive subsidy to the richest companies in the United States, to like these big telecom companies. So the question that I would ask is have these alternative networks, the energy we've put into them, municipal or community, have they actually weakened the role that big tech plays in the actual perpetuation of the governing block of society? Have they done that? Or have they been a part of helping that block to expand because they haven't been couched enough in an organized strategy for a more liberatory vision tied in with all of the needs that people have? Have they been part of building an alternative logic? And I would say the answer to that is not yet. They just haven't done that yet. That's just not where we're at right now. And it's really important for us to answer that question very directly. And it's going to be important for those of us who care about alternatives to pay really close attention to that role, not just of telecommunications companies and internet provision, but the role that big tech plays in financialization, the role that algorithms play as embedded in every kind of decision-making system, from the provision of benefits from the unemployment office to whether or not the state takes your kids away. There's super crucial parts of all of that stuff, a real banality of evil kind of situation. And so none of this is to say, I'm not a hater, none of this is to say that building these tools aren't important. It's not like having alternative frameworks and building them in a brick and mortar way teaches us a huge amount. But we have to understand that if we're not grounding that in our pursuit of long-term mass organizing towards governance in this country, towards governance where none of the rights that we have, whether they be water, housing, education, and access to the right to speak and the right to be heard, on the internet. If they're not grounded in that vision, we're just going to lose because we're just not organized enough to keep it. And it's going to make us weaker afterward. And I know this from experience. I have won campaigns against Comcast, which I can see if you look out the window. We have done that. We have been able to force them to build beautiful resources for hundreds of thousands of people in Philadelphia, to build and protect the local public access TV station here, which is one of the best in the world. We've been able to do that, but because we didn't keep our people organized around that force, they're just as strong as they ever were. We never actually were able to target them at their root of power. And there are examples of how to target them at their root of power, like in the fight around HQ2 in New York City, for example, which we can talk about later. So I'll just say that the last thing that I'll say is that there are really beautiful models of how to embed a vision of what communications can do directly inside the lifeblood of a neighborhood, the lifeblood of a community. The Detroit Community Technology Project is quite an interesting one. But it's also really small because it really has to do with the direct one-on-one conversations and base building that permit folks to build an alternative network that truly meets and speaks to people's needs. And I'm not saying that we should go small, but I'm saying that it's important for any sector that focuses on the provision of broadband and the provision of communications to actually be really clear about our role, which is not as torchbearers for our own vision and our own future, but as technical servants for what I think is an increasingly more and more building popular social left in the United States that will need us when they are ready to start building and contending for power, to have the assessment that we can help bring about those choke points in capital, about how technology works, so we can be our part in that army of taking them down. That's what I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. That was very, I think everyone will have lots to say building off of that. That's great. Okay, are we doing questions now or do we want to save them to the end maybe? Would that make sense? Okay, maybe we'll move to Chris and then we'll save our questions.
I'm going to PowerPoint this.
Oh, yes.
Scooch. Back at Annenberg. It's great to see old friends. It's great to hopefully meet some new friends. It's great to be in a room with people that I've been fanboying over for a while. Sandeep, I'm looking at you over there. So hoping to meet some folks as well. So I thought that my contribution for this panel could be around what a local people-first approach to broadband would look like. And a lot of this is coming out of my book on rural broadband policy in the United States, some new work I'm doing around counties, and then the role of qualitative storytelling in broadband policy. So, I want to start off with a bit of a provocation. All local broadband is the best broadband. What do I mean by this? First, I mean that broadband is fundamentally local, in that at the end of the day, it ends up at our computers on our with a handset, right, with our laptops, with our desktops, with a wireless router. Second, local broadband is accountable, and I'm going to be talking about that particularly in the form of cooperatives. And third, local broadband is trusted. And I'm particularly going to focus on two neglected elements, I think, of local broadband. One are counties, and the other is cooperatives. And so I'm going to spend the rest of my 15 minutes convincing you all as to why local broadband is the best broadband. Obviously, so much of us are here because we're trying to figure out how to make the most out of $65 billion that are about to flow down the pipes, right? And Hannah, I think you said it so right, when we need to be thinking about not only, the democratization of the internet, but the democratization of these resources, right? Because otherwise, the political economy of broadband is such that it will favor the largest and the loudest over local community and alternative entrants, right? So how do we in this room make the most out of $65 billion from the federal government? And to do this, I want to take us back to March of 2021, when President Biden said that broadband is the next electricity. Right? And he did this in the announcement of what was then called the American Jobs Plan, what would then become the Infrastructure Act. Broadband is the next electricity. Now, I think this is something that we've often heard, and is something that is essentially making to be that broadband is as important, as essential today as electricity was 100 years ago. Right? But to me, there is more than just that. It is a call to answer a question of how do we connect a country. So we're going to do a little bit of a history lesson here to figure out how we did this in the 1930s. And this happened with the Rural Electrification Administration. And I love talking about this. I see Nathan smiling over here, and so much of this slide is based on his work, so thank you for that, friend. This idea that in Roosevelt's New Deal, he created in 1935 an emergency agency known as the Rural Electrification Administration, which was made permanent in 1936 and part of the Department of Agriculture in 1939. The mission of the REA was to bring electricity to rural communities, and in doing so, in the words of Roosevelt, bring modernity, right, to the countryside. We can problematize this kind of civilization discourse later. But to accomplish this, the REA turned not to incumbent power companies, and this is a really important lesson, I think, for us. They turned not to incumbent power companies, but rather to local communities themselves. They encouraged and funded the creation of local electric cooperatives. And more than this, they went out to rural communities and did so as part of what was known as the REA Circus. I love this idea, to teach people about the usefulness of electricity. We could think about this really as a precursor to digital inclusion and digital equity programs today, the REA Circus. Rural electricity soared from 33% in 1940 to 96% in 1956. And in the process, hundreds of rural electric cooperatives were created. So successful was this program that in 1949, when it was noticed that rural telephone subscribers had dropped off and hadn't been picked up after the Great Depression, the Rural Telephone Act was passed, giving the REA responsibility over rural telephony as well. And again, they did the same thing. They bypassed AT&T and went directly towards local telephone cooperatives. The moral of the story here is that when charged to connect this country, the REA went local and did so with tremendous success. So what are the kind of things that we can learn here? Large companies, large electric companies, were unwilling to serve rural areas. We see this today, right? We had a coordinated and disciplined plan for rural connectivity. We do not see this today. They went local. We're all here in this room because we want to see this today. They prioritized cooperatives, right, which we're starting to see as well. They met people where they are, and I think this is particularly important for all of us, right? If we're going to connect people with affordable, high-performance broadband with all of the bells and whistles of digital equity and digital inclusion, we need to make sure that we're meeting folks where they are. And then they repeated these steps with telephony. There is precedent here for going local. And of course, communities are the ones who are doing so much of the great connecting. And in 2012, Olivier Sylvain coined the term broadband localism, which is a term that I absolutely adore. And he did this to capture the importance of municipal broadband initiatives And in my work, I expand this idea of broadband localism to include not only municipalities, but a host of other local stakeholders, especially cooperatives and counties. So communities across the country are connecting themselves despite policy and market failure, right? We're seeing telephone and electric cooperatives become, as I've called in previous work, the unsung heroes of rural connectivity. And we're also seeing the importance of public-private partnerships, although we can absolutely problematize this in the distribution of resources as well. And I just want to give a couple of examples of really cool local initiatives along the digital equity axis. In Louisa County, Virginia, the county started a program called WOW, Wireless on Wheels, where solar-powered hotspots were wheeled to underconnected neighborhoods during the pandemic. Band-Aid solution? Absolutely, but an innovative local solution nonetheless. Black Churches for Digital Equity, for broadband, what is now called Black Churches for Digital Equity, have engaged in a massive publicity campaign to inform their parishioners about the importance of what was then called the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, and now the Affordable Connectivity Program. Libraries. Libraries are the heroes of connectivity during the pandemic, right? In particular, their ability to provide wireless connectivity in their parking lots and in developing hotspot loan programs. And in one of my favorite examples, and I swear I talk about this example every single time I give a talk now, which is that in upstate New York, Orleans County started training digital navigators like those working for the YMCA and Meals on Wheels to help homebound folks with their technical issues, right? Again, thinking about the fact that connectivity is so much more than wires in the ground. A network is useless unless we can afford it and know how to use it. We need to meet folks where they are. And I think this example is a great idea of going local. I know we don't have a ton of time. I'm going to go quick. Some of you have heard this before, but two great examples from my work, first coming from my book and then coming from some work I did with Nicholas Matthews. I call this a tale of two counties. The first is Rock County, Minnesota, population 9,300. They wanted a fiber optic network and they wouldn't settle for anything less. They were rebuffed by the major telecommunications providers. Not enough people, not enough customer base, the same old thing we've heard over and over and over again. So they partnered with Alliance Communications, a telephone cooperative out of South Dakota. They won a $5 million grant from the Minnesota Broadband Office. They bonded themselves for $1 million. And then Alliance Communication put in $6 million. In one calendar year, which includes a winter in Minnesota, which is not to be taken for granted, they had a 99.93% pass by for fiber, right? Just incredible. And a lot of this had to do with trust, right? And this is a quote from the county administrator, Mr. Kyle Older. And this is about partnering with a cooperative. Part of it was we knew they were in Garrettston. Garrettston is 19 miles away from Rock County. I wasn't signing a deal with some guy in Texas, AT&T, right? I was signing a deal with a neighbor. There's board members that have this, that have to have still live in the community if they screw this. So yeah, there was faith, but it was not a crazy amount of faith. It was if they told us they were going to do something, we had every reason to believe them. Right, this idea of trust and localism and proximity became so important in the success of Rock County. Moving on, I want to talk about Surry County, Virginia. Surry County, Virginia in 2020 was the least connected county in the Commonwealth, 3.6% fixed. And Nicholas Matthews and I did interviews with what does life look like in a broadband desert? And one of the things that we found was that community members were stuck in a loop of waiting. Right? If they didn't have connectivity, they were waiting for that connectivity, and we heard things like, I'll believe it when I see it. If they had connectivity, it was usually subpar with a crazy amount of buffering, and one person said, load fucker, right? Just waiting for that spinning wheel of death. The other thing they were waiting for was for the day to be over, so that midnight would begin, their data caps would end, and people would be off the satellite network in order to do their work. This family called themselves a second shift family, where they would take a nap late at night, wake up at midnight to do homework, to do schooling, to do gaming, right? A second shift family. And I think, if I'm going to charge everyone in this room to work towards is to making sure there are no more second shift families in this country, right? Thankfully, thanks to a electric cooperative, Prince George Electric Cooperative, with their rural band service, Surrey County is now being served, right? But there are so many second shift families around the country. Like I said, I'm quite bullish about cooperatives. Like municipal options, co-ops primarily operate where big telco companies refuse to offer service. They often offer faster speeds and lower costs for consumers. They are trusted by consumers and communities alike. They also see broadband as an investment in the community and are willing to take a much longer return on investment, right? If you look at a company like Comcast, which is now Lumen, which is slightly Brightspeed, you'll find that they demand a quarterly return on investment. The cooperatives that I spoke with are much more willing to take even 20 years to get a return on investment. So there is something there about this local proximity when it comes to broadband. And this is why I say, when we think about an expanded notion of broadband localism that Sylvain was talking about, we need to include things like libraries, families, municipalities, community centers, faith-based organizations, cooperatives, even local and regional ISPs, counties, and states. This is all part of what we can think about as broadband localism. All right, so let's talk about policy. I know I'm running out of time. Right? How much time do I got? 2 minutes? Oh, I can totally do this in 2 minutes. All right. We're going to talk about policy for a sec. And one of the things, if I could leave you all with one thought in your head that you can all take home, is the following. Broadband is not about technology or politics, policies or profits or companies. Broadband is about people. And I think this is something that policymakers have largely forgotten in our fetishization of mapping and our fetishization of speeds, is at the end of the day, broadband is about that second shift family. So the provocation for us, then, is how do we create a local, people-first approach to broadband? And I have some thoughts on this. And here we go. A local, people-centered approach to broadband has the following elements. It is proximate. And what do I mean by that? Oh, I don't know what I mean by that. It means that it is locally provided and accountable. It is provided by a trusted local partner. But it also means having a robust state broadband office that can help with planning and policy and deployment. It is also cooperative. And this does not necessarily mean it has to be provided by a cooperative, right? But this idea that planning and deployment is done in concert between a provider and a community. And what is particularly important here is that the state broadband plans, as mandated by the NTIA, mandates local participation, right? And this is very important. It also has to be accessible. It is very difficult to access money, both for the provider and for the subscriber, right? If you think about something like the Affordable Connectivity Program, the $30 a month subsidy from the FCC, multiple people are having problems enrolling in it, and of course the money is going to dry up next year. Right? What will be crucial, especially for municipalities and counties when we think about accessibility, is that 18 states, as we all know, presently ban or inhibit municipal broadband. And the question here is, will states like Texas and Kentucky and Illinois be able to avail themselves of NTIA money with these restrictions in place? A local people-centered approach to broadband also has to be equitable. Equitable in that the digital divide supersedes the rural-urban dialectic and exists wherever power inequality exists. And I think this is exactly what Hannah was telling us, right? This is about power inequality. Indeed, some have argued that the digital divide isn't about the digital at all, but is entirely about power. Equity policy ensures that the un- and underconnected, regardless of geography, are served. It has to be inclusive. Inclusive means that we need to think beyond the first modality of access, and also think of affordability, skill development, and hardware. I've said it before and I'll say it again, a broadband network is useless unless people can afford to use it and know how to harness it. And last but not least, it has to be accountable. Companies and entities winning grants must be held accountable, both to their communities and to the government. And again, this is why I'm so bullish about cooperatives, because we've seen that commitment to accountability before with them. And with that in mind, I want to thank you all very much. Oh, there was a really cute picture of my dog and I there, but it seems to have blocked. But I can show that to you all later. But thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
fantastic. It's kind of great to go after Chris because I'm going to be talking about a particular model that does talk about not exactly counties, but contiguous small towns coming together. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's a little strange to be back here, but also fantastic. So I'm going to be talking about communication union districts out of Vermont, which is a specific local policy corrective. Here's a state pursuing, it's a statewide policy that's pursuing public broadband, and we can get into what does that actually look like, what are some of the tensions that emerge when people are trying to practice the kinds of politics that we in this room are hoping to work towards. This is a project, so I'm at the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society. We're a broadband policy-focused nonprofit, and this project I'm working with my colleague at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which are big promoters of municipal broadband. I think a lot of you in the room probably know of them. So today I'm just going to give you a little bit of overview of what CUDs are, where they come from, a little bit of history, and then talk about, this is a work in progress, so I welcome feedback. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the emergent themes that we're seeing through our interviews. Okay, so what are CUDs? Communication union districts are an organization of, oh, I don't know, there was animation in my thing. Okay. They're an organization of 2 or more towns that join together as a municipal entity to build communication infrastructure together. The idea is that you're sort of building together, you're aggregating demand. It's about density in rural areas, as we all know. Important thing to know about CUDs is that they cannot access the property taxing authority of member towns, but they can do municipal bonds. So when they come together, they're a municipal entity that can raise funds, but it doesn't affect municipal budgets, which is hugely important. The legal framework for CUDs has actually been around for 2015. I'll touch upon that shortly. But the real push to make them came as a result of COVID. The need became so blatant in rural Vermont, but also there was funding. And Vermont passed in 2021 Act 71, which establishes the Vermont Community Broadband Board as an entity to support the formation of CUDs, channel the emergency funds that were becoming available. And it's also worth noting that it used to be that member towns had to vote, at least 2 member towns had to vote in person and say, yes, we will join the CUD. Under Act 71, those rules were relaxed a little bit. Now the select board could vote to join. The core of the legislation is 2 things, universality and accountability, to speak to Chris's presentation last. So if we're providing public funding, if we're providing dollars to address broadband, then we need to make sure that every single home, every single residence is accounted for. You have to plan for everyone. So CUDs basically function as the provider of last resort, which is great, but also it's a high bar for brand new organizations. And accountability. So this is very much in the ethic of neighbors providing service to each other. There are public meetings. This is a municipal entity. There's public meetings. You have to your minutes have to go up at a certain time, and this is something that people have to learn how to do. And the goal is, and this is also worth noting, like we're not talking about wireless service, we're not talking about 25.3, the goal is 100 symmetrical, which is pretty ambitious. Ooh. So CUDs exist because a group of towns created a CUD before the legislative framework for this existed. This is EC Fiber, which in 2007 was a group of towns that got together and formed what was then called an intra-local contract. And they decided that they wanted community-owned fiber network. They today have 7,500 subscribers of fiber to the home network. In 2020, 8 more towns joined, so there's about 31 towns working. They're the pioneers that sort of pushed the legislation that created that helped create the other CUDs. And their push was primarily because an intra-local contract between 23 towns didn't make a lot of sense to the municipal bond market. So it was a push to get some legitimacy and be able to make sense outside of Vermont. So we're kind of like a sewer district. You should let us put bonds out and raise some financing. Because they've been the model for the last, 15 years, they've been hugely influential for the other CUDs. Other CUDs sort of follow them, not explicitly because the CUDs have separate models, but they turn to them for advice on staffing structure, on how to plan and design a network, et cetera. But it's also worth noting that as of January 2023, the operator is no longer going to be EC Fiber. It's going to be Great Works Internet, which is a B Corp out of ISP out of Maine. They decided that despite being the standout success story from Vermont, they've reached a point where in order to scale any further, they needed to hand it off to a more professional ISP. And we can talk about how CUDs think about their evaluations around partners. Who do they trust and why? There are 10 CUDs now, including EC Fiber. They represent 213 of 252 municipalities in Vermont. Besides EC Fiber, NEK, which is Northeast Kingdom, is already built and some portion of it is built, and they are providing service in the Northeast Kingdom. And the other 8 are in some sort of phase of either planning or building, and they all have different models. So of the 10, let me see, Northworks Fiberworks is the only one that has an open access model. A couple are sort of figuring out what their private providers are going to be, and Otter Creek and Southern Vermont are public-private partnerships. Right, they are trying to break up who's going to own, who's going to engineer, who's going to procure, who's going to construct, who's going to operate, and who's going to maintain. And it doesn't always make sense for them, for the CUDs, to do all of that work together. Okay, so what is the experience of working on CUDs? To start with, there is a very palpable and explicit sense of federal failure. They will talk about, and Chris would know this well, they talk about the FCC's light touch regulatory approach as quite often as a boondoggle. VTEL gets brought up a lot, which got like $100 million in subsidies and loans with nothing much to show for it. So there is this frustration that the state itself is preempted from regulating providers, and the federal government has let them down. At the same time, there's also a very clear-eyed perspective on the fact that this is a once-in-a-generation funding opportunity. This is going to be the difference maker, but in order for it to make the difference in rural Vermont, it's going to have to be under local control. So as Hannah was talking about, a lot of alternative, and as Chris was mentioning, a lot of alternative infrastructure models have been small. So the scale of the solution is sort of really hard to avoid. Vermont's very tiny. I'm sure we all know that. Philly is 2.5 times the size of Vermont. So although the CUDs are designed to sort of build to economies of scale, so you put some dense towns and less dense towns together, and maybe you come up with a market that actually makes sense. You do bulk purchasing of fiber together. You buy financial services together. You try to cooperate enough that what a small town couldn't do themselves, a group of towns could do. But at the core of it, it's still about neighbors connecting neighbors. So you have folks that will tell you that the thing that kept me going on this project is because I know that 5 of my neighbors down on this next mile are signing up for this service, so I need to make sure that this happens. The other thing that's also worth noting about is because Vermont is so small, they also feel like they've gotten to sort of fly under the radar. Till the big money comes down, they haven't had as much opposition from large ISPs. They'll say about, we're not even a line item on anyone's budget, or we're just off the radar. So that's been really beneficial for them, although now it's beginning to change. And when other states try to replicate this model, so Maine has seen some really contested battles around towns trying to do municipal broadband. Vermont folks will also tell you we are who you think we are. So there is a certain Vermontiness to the solution. There is a political culture that they will all cite. It's a citizen legislature. The person that helped pass, one of the core people that helped pass Act 71, she's a waitress for her day job. So there is this roll up the sleeves, we get involved. Towns have voice votes, that's how they make decisions. So there's an infrastructure already in place, and there's a political culture about coming together to make decisions. And that's been necessary because this has been hours, hundreds and thousands of hours of volunteer time to make this happen. The people that are elected to Every town has one member be a part of the CUD, and that's who makes the decision, the executive board. And very rarely, only after about 2 or 3 years of them being in existence, do they then hire staff. And most have like one person. They have like one executive director on staff. It's worth pointing out, though, because it's Vermont, and Vermont is a relatively rich state, the people they have are very convenient in terms of their expertise. They have VPs from Comcast. They have folks that have worked in telecom before. There are folks that have done the financing around T-Mobile mergers. So when the volunteer sort of skill set that they're able to tap isn't going to be widely available everywhere. Even within the CUDs that aren't able to have those folks, they are finding themselves a little slow to get off the ground. They're finding it harder to know which contractors to work with, who's going to take you for a ride. But for and then the last piece being, of course, we know from a lot of democratic communications work, scholarship, that who volunteers, for how long they volunteer burnout, volunteer vacuum, all of this stuff exists, which is multiplied because that takes a little while to learn. And by the time you get to understand take rates and passings and various things about fiber, you're done. You've been doing the second job for the last 3 years, and keeping that momentum going is proving challenging for a lot of the CUDs. Because it's a hard thing to do, am I okay on time? Okay. Because it's a hard thing to do on your own, they are looking at other providers as partners. So there was a well-publicized sort of breakdown of the relationship with Google Fiber in 2 of the CUDs. They were going to do open access models with Google Fiber as the anchor tenant. At the 11th hour, the math didn't work out for Google Fiber, or it didn't work out for the CUDs, but that relationship fell apart. And there's a fair amount of cynicism around sort of large companies coming in now. So they look at other local-ish ISPs to think through how to do partnerships. So Maple Broadband has a partnership with Waitsfield Telecom, Champlain Valley, which is a Vermont provider, and that's really important to them. They're like, we know these people, to what Chris was saying earlier. We know these folks. They've been around for a really long time. Yes, their copper network is trash, but they are building a fiber network. We see them building a fiber network, and it means something else. The other thing that they're also talking about is, like, what does local control actually mean? And this is something that different CUDs have slightly different approaches. Like, some are very clear, like, we are not interested in being an ISP. Others are like, their starting point is, our responsibility is like the decision-making authority. We are the owners of this network on behalf of the citizens. So our responsibility is fiscal. But the existential conversation that they're having about what local control means often translates into what one of them called accountability by contract. So they have quarterly service reviews, so which includes not just minimums around latency, throughput, other things, the number of complaints, but also Consolidated has to show up to town meetings at some threshold whenever they're called upon, maybe once a year, I think. So they were like building in provisions into their legal relationship in order to make sure they get the kind of services that they're hoping for. Sort of zooming out a little bit, part of the reason that provision is challenging for them, and part of the reason that they work primarily as correctives, to answer the opening question for the whole panel, is both the market constraints. It is expensive to serve less dense areas, but also policy constraints. So they're not allowed, as CUDs, although they are required to be providers of last resort, they are not allowed to, quote unquote, overbuild. So they cannot provide services in the parts of town which would be financially more viable for them. Well, they can provide services, but they're not going to be able to use grant funding to fund that portion of the network. So they have to cobble together money from a variety of sources in order to make that possible. So we both give them the hardest task by policy, and then we also hamper their ability to be viable entities. And that's something that CUDs are, like, that's just a challenge that they haven't been able to overcome. But what is heartening is that they are incredibly focused on what they call capital P, capital G, public good. Public decision making is really important. But again, that cuts both ways. They've had, they'll tell you horror stories about like presenting plans to member towns and saying, hey, this is our plan for when we're going to build, and then getting swooped by Comcast and Charter, who'll come in and build just enough to make that kind of overbuilding a problem again. They're really committed to affordability measures. So Southern Vermont went with Consolidated as a partner because when they were going to build out the network themselves, they would start charging people upwards of $80, and they're like, well, it isn't equitable, to Chris's point. Like, this is not going to serve most of our residents. And what's really interesting, and I guess this is something that I hadn't anticipated when I started doing this research, is they're really, really thinking about the long-term development of Vermont. Like, they'll talk to you about climate change, so they'll talk to you about the demographic changes they anticipate coming to Vermont, and wanting to build a community that still remains Vermont, which is a tricky prospect, but is still welcoming to newcomers and builds a diverse economic base for folks. Like I mentioned, CUDs are sort of spreading beyond Vermont. There's models in Maine, New Hampshire, and Washington. None of them are really, have really taken off much, and Maine, like I said earlier, is facing a ton of constraints and policy challenges. That's everything.
Okay, over to me. And I basically completely disassembled and reconfigured everything I'm about to say. It's going to be a bit extemporaneous. Mainly because there's just so much amazing information here that brought up so many other things in my brain. And so I'm hoping that, we can also get pretty quickly to the conversation that I think is desperately needed, not just in this panel, but in this room over the course of the day and beyond. I've been fighting these battles since the turn of the millennia, which makes me sort of OG community networking kind of guy. Back in the day, like Ethan was a young man, I think, when we first started working together. So, but it is also the case that there have been a huge number of people that have been in this battle on the front lines for decades. And in many ways, I think we are rediscovering the historical failures that we have faced in these domains and like-minded domains. I mean, LPFM should be a thriving, booming industry. And Hannah, I would guess you've laid down on the tracks dozens of times over the years on this, and the fact that it remains as even existent today is solely due to a tiny group of individuals that fought the battle and carved out something viable. And in many ways, I feel like we keep doing exactly this. We declare ourselves winner with the crumbs that are left behind. And so when I think about Philadelphia, and I think about the rich history here in this city of attempts and failures around delivering broadband services, and I think about the mythology of Earthlink as the municipal network, which it wasn't. It was an Earthlink network where they took advantage like a vampire. I mean, it's like, it was a partnership in terms of like there was a victim, the city of Philadelphia, and then there's the vampire, that was Earthlink, and that was the partnership. And I remember testifying before our city council at the height of that and basically saying, this thing's gonna fall apart. It's not gonna work. It's not gonna work because you don't have buy-in from the local community. And everyone was like, what the hell are you guys talking about? We even wrote a whole report named The Philadelphia Story, because we were completely unimaginative, but documenting why this was going to fall apart. And it had everything to do with local control, local governance, and the complete lack of any of that in the model. And it took, another year, 3 before it completely fell apart, but that it did. And we really didn't learn a whole lot from those early failures. The municipal wireless boom of 2005 led to a huge array of pretty bastardly terrible networks being built out, dysfunction, de facto redlining in the service areas. It was like, oh, the rich white business districts will have a hot zone there. And you're like, that's not even where people live. Like, well, that's where we're going to put our time and energy? That makes no sense. So when my team ghost wrote the Philadelphia Freedom Rings proposal, along with folks like Hannah and others, we sort of had this radical progressive group doing this. And it started off really well. But then as soon as the money rolled in, it was like big players kind of elbowed into the mix of this and kind of slowly but inevitably changed the nature of that program. And I won't call it a total failure, but I would say that it failed to achieve the original vision of those that actually created the proposal in the first place. It got transmogrified in many ways. And so now I'm sort of at least at phase 3, third time's a charm maybe, with the current allocations of funding. And I've been, I'm older, more grizzled, and sort of like, okay, how do we kind of address this problem that we've seen again and again, just in my own time, just here in Pennsylvania? And so we've created this Broadband Innovation Consortium. We've got the cities of Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Penn State, Carnegie Mellon, UPitt, and Temple University, all collaborating in sort of the anchor institutions to give it gravitas, because we know we're going to get hit upside and down by Comcast as soon as they realize what we're doing. And what we're doing is providing sort of a large scale or regional scale, a state scale network that has open interconnection, transparent pricing and transit, free as in beer, connectivity for anyone that themselves is not reselling, is doing digital equity work, is providing services like the Philly Wireless Project here, Philly Community Wireless Project here, MetaMesh over in Pittsburgh. We just give them free connectivity because we understand that that is a value add. That's a public interest for that network. And because of that, we know we're going to get just absolutely like annihilated if we don't have our own big gorillas, thus the anchor institutions. But also core to this is we need a governance structure that isn't those core institutions, right? You can imagine how awkward this is. Like, hey, would you guys like to join and be disempowered in this new collaborative? But they're in. And I lay that at the feet of the 6 CIOs that themselves currently understand this dynamic. That is the sea change we have seen today versus yesteryear. That people are beginning to at least understand the import of this. Now, of course, I don't want to be overly optimistic on this. And anyone that knows me knows, like, this is going to get very depressing very quickly from this point forward. But, what we have seen is sort of a really fascinating thing in telecommunications. When you actually think about it, we, the people, are so powerful. Which is to say, we own the land and the rights of way upon which all of this fiber infrastructure is being built. We own the airwaves that all mobile communications happens over. We're the clients of these networks, and through our monthly fees, we actually are the funders of these networks. Now, into that power, you have to imagine that there has been a systematic, multi-generational, massive, multi-billion-dollar effort that had to take place to disempower us. And that is very much what we've had. Which is to say, we started very powerful, thus the home rule movements of yester-century and what have you. We made a series of Faustian bargains that were immediately abrogated by, these companies, to lead us down a pathway where we are now as disempowered as we are, and finally beginning to really meaningfully fight back over this. And I would argue that nowhere is this process perhaps more apparent in the US than in Indian country, where I've been working for the past 15 years. Climbing around on rooftops, falling off of rooftops, having a good time, having a terrible time. But long story short, after this initial genocidal mania of 500 years ago, you had sort of the stealing of that land. In the treaty rights of the 1840s and onward, tribes kept any natural resource that was not granted elsewhere. And since Marconi was still far into the future, nobody gave away their spectrum rights, which is to say Tribes own their spectrum. They've never been given a chance. We had to fight for years to get one tribal priority window over the 2.5 gigahertz band. And the FCC, officials there told me explicitly they expect, a couple dozen tribes maybe to apply for this. Well, 186 tribes later, and they're like, oh, I guess people would use these frequencies, these resources, if even allowed to. But then you look at the auction 108, the 2.5 gigahertz auction results, the other 99.9% of the spectrum all went, almost all of it, 90% of it went to T-Mobile, including large swaths that are over reservations in Indian country. So that is where we are in many ways. And when I look at, say, the tribal build-out window from NTIA, they've put $3 billion into tribal broadband, which is great and a joke. Which is to say, they put out this RFP, they had $1 billion in the first tranche, they got $5.8 billion in applications. And they're like, oh crap, what do we do? So they moved $1 billion from tranche 2, so now we have $2 billion that they're now divvying up and handing out. And we need like at least an order of magnitude more funding than that to solve the systematic under-provisioning of Indian country. Likewise, it's great that we got $42.45 billion in federal funding for build-out. That is, I would guess, really good earnest money. It's like, I think they're actually thinking about solving the digital divide, so they've put up $42.45 billion, and that's probably, I'd guess, 10% of what's actually needed. And I remember arguing with Blair Levin, 2010, publicly, about, and he was like whispering at me while we were up on stage, saying like, I love it when you throw like, I think the time I was saying 430 billion was needed. He's like, I love it when you use this number because it makes anything I say sound reasonable. I'm like, but you do know we do actually need this much money, right? It was a joke. And it remains a joke in many ways. And I would say what we've won today is an acknowledgement that there is a digital divide. That was a big fight. That this isn't a luxury good. That was a multi-year big fight.
It was a multi-decade thing.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And now we have some modest money. But when I look at, for example, Pennsylvania, anyone heard of Chapter 30? What if I told you that about 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, we made a Faustian bargain. We told Verizon, hey, we'll allow you to raise your rates, we'll give you a whole bunch of tax subsidies, and in return, you will provide universal 45 megabit symmetric service. And they took the deal. They raised their rates, they took the tax breaks, and they promised 45 megabit symmetric service. Well, they quickly realized this was going to be expensive, so they got the state legislature to change the definition to 1.544 megabits per second by 200 kilobits per second and call that broadband. Now, what if I told you that the official definition of broadband remains 1.544 megabits per second by 200 kilobits per second in the state of Pennsylvania? So that when somebody says, yeah, we're providing broadband in Pennsylvania, you're like, do you mean the federal definition or the state definition? Because those are radically different. What if I told you that even under this new definition, universal 1.544 by 200 kilobits per second, that in December of 2015, Verizon testified before the state legislature and said, mission accomplished. We have achieved universal connectivity, broadband. You can look up this ridiculous statement, and everyone's like, great, we're done here. We're so done here that now we can do things like pass state bills that make it illegal for municipalities to roll out connectivity. And so we have this Title 66, paragraph 3014, subpart H, that makes it against the law for a municipality to roll out a for-fee broadband service. I'm like, well, let's all do free service, obviously. Or any public-private partnership with a municipality involved. It's weird because all these same politicians that are like, we hate municipalities, it should all be public-private partnerships. I'm like, you do realize this law makes those illegal too, right? And they don't. Or let's fast forward to Wednesday, this Wednesday, at 3 p.m. So we have the U.S. Treasury, and they've released a whole bunch of money on the Capital Projects Fund all across the country. You can build bridges, update your electrical grid. A bunch of us fought successfully to get our allocation, $279 million to the state of Pennsylvania, 100% allocated for broadband build-out. We won that battle. And so now the state's like, oh crap, what do we do? And they're like, well, we're going to set up this broadband authority at the 11th hour and 59th minute and scramble them, basically receive all these funds, which they did. Now, the Treasury funds come with no caveats. You can spend it for whatever you want. And so what did the State Broadband Authority do? Well, they released funding criteria, the eligibility criteria, this Wednesday, 3 p.m. And they said, okay, you can only use these funds in underserved, no, sorry, not even underserved, in unserved areas of the state, which eliminates pretty much all of our cities. You have to provide a universal service to the region that you're covering. Now, you may think this is great, except they've also said, but you cannot overbuild any existing infrastructure in those same regions. So how do you build a regional network without overbuilding anything? If you figure out that answer, let me know. And you have to bring a 25% match. So if you're not deeply capitalized to begin with, forget about it. So I'm like, well, this happened Wednesday at 3 p.m., but I was like, I've got, a bit of time between now and like being on stage on Friday. So let me take these data around the BSLs, the broadband service service locations in the national map, which apparently the state is in the midst of trying to get more access to. And as it turns out, before the FCC put up its its warning that to access these public data was a felony under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, my team had already exfiltrated the data. So we have it, and we're going to make use of it. So I took those data, and I took, radical data from the U.S. Census about race, ethnicity, and I overlaid them. And I was like, so where are these magical underserved areas of the state that are now eligible for this fund? And it turns out, this Wednesday at 3 p.m., what the Broadband Authority has, and I would argue probably inadvertently, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but, maybe not. They've systematically created eligibility criteria that are moving these monies, it's $279 million, away from communities of color and directly to some of the whiter areas of the state. And that kind of institutionalized racism is upon us in pretty much everything when it comes to telecommunications, right? So, when we created Measurement Lab in 2009, it was as an experiment to show the FCC you could do crowdsourced data collection of broadband speeds. I literally was sitting in meetings with Walter and James Miller, Walter Johnson and James Miller, being like, hey, you guys should do this crowdsourced data collection. They're like, it cannot be done. I was like, cannot? I mean, really? Like, cannot be done? So we built it as an experiment. And the FCC said, hey, look, this is too little data. If you get a lot of data, let us know. And we got 50 terabytes of data. We went back to the FCC and we're like, here's 50 terabytes of data. And they're like, well, that's too much data. You'll have to analyze it yourself. So then, long story short, there was always another excuse to not look at these realities. Same thing with the broadband nutrition label, which we created in 2009 as well. We wanted broadband pricing transparency. So we came up with this crazy notion that is still right now almost about to be implemented. Right, it's actually passed the FCC in its kind of gimped form, but I'll take that as a win. It just hasn't shown up in the Federal Register yet to start the shot clock on when it becomes the law of the land. Cost of connectivity report, same thing. We created that in order to show how much more we're paying in the U.S., how much we're being overcharged for service. The Broadband Access in Pennsylvania report, where we documented all sorts of problems here. Price elasticity of demand, documenting the different ways in which various redlining in pricing structures is happening in Pennsylvania. Long story short, what I'm going to posit here, which is a little controversial, is that the digital divide is getting quite a bit worse. Which is to say, in an era of DSL connectivity, in an era of dial-up modems, If you had a phone, you had equitable internet. It all sucked. I mean, it was like, dial-up modem speeds, but everyone got it. And there were still haves and have-nots, but if you had it, you were all equal. Fast forward to today, and we've created this entire national structure of separate but equal in broadband service provisioning. And yes, rural communities are amongst the most screwed, but so are communities of color. It's like, and if you're poor, forget about it. Those three constituents are systematically provided second-class netizenship. And we simply refuse to even collect the data to document these realities. So we're $400+ million into doing national broadband mapping, and the current map sucks. That's our taxpayer dollars being expended to hide these broadband realities and maintain this kind of broadband Potomkin village. If you look at our current national broadband map right now today, you're basically being sold a fraud of the speeds available and the locations where that is available. So currently at the FCC, we've got a 2-2 FCC, 2 Dems, 2 Republicans. That's by design. Gigi Sohn was the collateral damage to that. But I don't know if anyone else in this room, what I'm hearing is that, Biden's planning on nominating Ana Gomez, which I think is terrible. But I'll tell you why. Like, she's got a pretty good history working at NTIA, at the FCC, and et cetera. And that's what everyone's going to hear about. It's her experience there. She has done a wee bit of work on some digital equity stuff, so I give her credit where that's due. The thing that no one's going to want to talk about is the fact that she's the former VP of Government Affairs for Verizon. She's one of the head lobbyists for the telcos, just like Ajit Pai. And so what I'll be curious to see is if all the people that rightfully were like, Ajit Pai is a former telco guy and terrible, he's clearly conflicted out, will those same individuals and organizations hold a Democrat to the same standards? I worry that we won't, which is to say, I think we'll settle for that. And I think that is kind of the problem, that we fail to make headway because systematically the people making our decisions are kind of separate but equal. And we have sort of the telecommunications equivalent of a constantly evolving set of Jim Crow-esque rules, regulations, barriers to entry, and et cetera, that are meant to prevent actual equity and equality in these domains and maintain that system of overcharging, under-providing, and et cetera. So with that provocative statement, I'll draw to a close and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So I wanted to open it up. I'm not sure if I'm sure there are questions amongst panelists as well, but maybe we'll open it up to the crowd for now.
Yeah, I have 2 questions to throw out there, and feel free to answer either. One, Hannah, you were talking about going to the root of power in order to make some changes, and I was wondering if any of you have built or have worked with folks to create a power map. We've been talking a lot of power mapping and foundations to see if the power maps that different folks create overlap in ways for us to actually assess if this is going to be an effective strategy or not. So I'd love to hear your take on that. And the other question, just to throw out there, is we talk so much about faster internet and like this growing inequity, but do we need faster internet? And how do we encourage ourselves to move towards degrowth, especially when we're considering changes to our climate, into our environment, into our resources? And yeah, I don't know. It seems like we're going towards an infinite number of progress that is actually going to create, most likely, our own destruction. So just wanted to hear your takes on either of those.
I can start if that's okay. Those are, I can't really deal with this microphone, everybody. Good?
Yeah.
Yes, not too close, not too far. Those are really useful questions, Carla. I really appreciate them. On the power mapping one, like, in order for those of us who hold a kind of a technical and professional or practical expertise on the levers of power about the provision of this human right, in a logic of capital, in a world in which it is provisioned almost exclusively for profit, to be able to try to have a foothold of its deployment that is based on a framework of that all of the awesome panelists here have laid out, of providing people with this kind of basic dignified service. In order to do that effectively, we're going to have to do something which is emotionally extremely hard, which will cause us to have to face, in some cases, some generational grief about our loss. And that thing is that we're going to have to choose. We're going to have to try to determine through the kind of power mapping you're describing, that's something my organization is leading and doing, like in conversation with groups like Free Press and a number of other groups, not just on broadband and digital inclusion, but on technology and the role it plays in, like I was saying before, in the perpetuation of the sort of capital project. We're going to have to determine what are the ways in which the corporate provision of telecommunications helps that block of society stay together. And we have some answers to that question. Like very briefly, I'll say, like, I'm also a veteran of like the Internet Essentials wars. And like Joe and I will remember, Sascha and I, Victor will remember, others in this room will remember that the provision of the very first discount digital inclusion internet program in the United States, at least in the modern era, from Comcast, was offered by David Cohen, who was the former chief of staff to the mayor of Philadelphia and then the governor, and then the head of some dumb title, like some community title. He was really the consigliere for the Roberts family. He was the best lobbyist in town, in the country. And he went to Washington and he said, if you let us buy NBC, I will give you a cookie. And that cookie will be, I think it was like 5 megabits down, 3 up, some ridiculously terrible amount of service that was limited to a community of people who were like, you have to have a kid on the food stand or the free lunch program and 10 other shit that we say that you are poor the fuck enough, excuse my French. And that became the framework under which the provision of internet as a discount charity program was provisioned not just by Comcast, but by every other telecommunications company. And so I use that as an example to be like, in that case, like attacking them where they feel proud, where they feel strong. Cohen loved that program. They love Internet Essentials. They have parties about it every year. Like attacking them where they feel proud and big was the way in which to like get a lot more out of them from community-based power based on like what they wanted. And that's how we did that in Philadelphia. That's how we'd like place in Baltimore, some amazing community organizations focused on youth, like Somos did it. That's how they did it in Detroit. And so I'm using that as an example. I'm not actually saying that that might be the most important thing, but it is incumbent upon particularly the organizations that hold organizing power in Washington and to a certain extent in the state capitals to choose, to go through basically conjunctural analysis and to determine what are the things that if we broke them would cause the coherence of government and politics and science to break a little bit and would then build the second product, would build our ability to win. And so I think it's a great idea to compare power maps in that. And then the last thing I'll say on, is it speed or it's speed versus extraction? I think that's a super interesting and important question, and that requires a second thing of us, which is that we have to be really humble in that the vision of the world in which children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren win is not ours to craft. That vision is for the organized communities of this country to craft, particularly those who are Black, brown, immigrant, poor, indigenous. And it is our responsibility to be like, here's the technical analysis we have. What is the framework of survival that you want? And those communities then have the ability, we need to support them to have the power to choose the balance between heat sinks of servers outside of Phoenix, Arizona, and increasing speed. That honestly serves more of a narrative of how the federal government wants to compete with China and honestly use this shit as a drumbeat to war than it has to do with the provision of internet or the right to communications as a human and civil right. But I'd love to hear what others have to say.
Yeah, so I'm a recovering quantoid. So if you look historically at where I got my start, was in quantitative statistics and psychology, and did a lot of what's called structural equation modeling, which is akin to power mapping. And most power maps attempt to essentialize these relationships, identify things without any understanding of the undergirding chaos in a lot of these spaces. That you have, in essence, very different and very discrepant loadings, if you will, like on how relationships are actually mediated. It is constantly in flux. And as such, it is extremely difficult to put on paper the agility necessary to utilize something like a power map to any meaningful effect. And I don't mean that to say like you shouldn't do power mapping, but rather that they are often huge heuristics that then are used often almost entirely to non-effect because of that. And I think a lot of that comes down to then the reason why you have these experts, people like Hannah, that you say like, hey, look, this is what we kind of mapped out. What's the lay of the land today, this afternoon? Right, because that's going to really determine then, in essence, what parts of that power map make sense, where the fracture points have shifted. No place, I think, is this constant shift more noticeable, let's say, than in DC, which I think Hannah's absolutely right. So in DC, like China is the new boogeyman. We thought we had like another few years with Russia, but then Ukraine was like, hold my beer. And now we're like, oh shit, we need somebody else. So like China it is. And so now we're, everything China is, scary, scary, scary. And we're all worried about 5G in China, which is hilarious because I'm like, well, 5G means that they've got something undergirding the 5G. So as soon as you start looking beneath that, you realize, 93% of builds in China now are fiber to the home. Fiber to the home. I don't even see that reported in the U.S. And I'm like, so 5G is like a symptomology of like we're like, how do we treat this? I'm like, we're getting kicked to the curb over here, and nobody's even paying attention to that. And we wouldn't want to. Like, you could imagine if the Congress actually wanted to win the 5G war, we'd have to address the lack of fiber. And to do that, we'd have to address the power relationships at play with like all the political economy of these mega corporations that have created this disparate, terrible infrastructure that we have. So now we're like, well, national security doesn't actually matter. Because to do that, we'd actually have to challenge Comcast and Verizon, and so we don't. To me, it's like, power map that? Good luck. But I feel like that's why all of this needs to constantly be rechecked with people that are on the front lines and people that actually know what the lay of the land looks like right here, right now. And I'd also argue that a lot of this comes down to the individuals in power. And this would be sort of a critique of political economy writ large, even though I'm a political economist. I feel like oftentimes this is like one individual who's making a decision and then other people follow, or a couple individuals, and weird things affect their decisions, which is why lobbying works, frankly. It's those individualized relationships, gilded with, yacht trips or whatever the else Clarence Thomas is taking these days. But like, it is very individualized. And so I would say power mapping is a great tool in the bat belt, but I would hate us to rely on that to help develop strategy or even tactics.
Thank you all so much. So it seems it's just you laid it out right there, Sascha. So it's sort of like what comes up for me, like listening to this, are two big issues, right? One is how do we contest and fight the privatization of public life on every level, right? And specifically in this country, which is it's corruption, right? It's corporations driving political decisions on every level, right? And maybe we're uniquely in a bad situation when it comes to that. And then the second, so that's like one thing I know you all care about that, and so I want your thoughts on what could work, right? And then the other is, our interests are in equality and justice more generally, outside of access, equity of access, right? Knowing, that not to critique equity of access in a vacuum, but we know that in and of itself opens many up to, platform domination, datafication, manipulation, surveillance, all these issues. So what's a sort of full stack vision of equity that recognizes this is part of such, but, and I guess that in a way that's why we're all here, to kind of think on these different layers, right? And across these different layers. So those are the things that I'm always thinking about. And I'll talk about this a little bit later myself. I work with a lot of community media activists in the global south, and they're sort of concluding like, yeah, it's rad that we got everybody online on their own terms, it's cooperative, it's like leftist, it's all this stuff. But, oh no, they're just like gonna get messed with by, Meta, Facebook, and the NSA surveillance net, right? Extraterritorial surveillance. So what do we do?
He talks a lot, y'all should.
I mean, that's a great question. I'm gonna throw some ideas out there and something might stick. But what my gut says, I mean, to the first question about how can we, work through combating our contemporary political economy, right? Which is corrupt, which is corporately dominated. I constantly think about, as Frederick Jameson and Mark Fisher said, like it's easy to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? How do we imagine the end of a capitalist internet? Certainly Victor and David has written about this, and forgive me if I'm about to sound naive, but I do think a lot of this begins with communities themselves, and of course we can problematize the idea of community. But I was actually also reflecting on your question on the fetishization of speed, right? We need to make sure that communities are empowered to make the right decisions for them. And here's what I'm seeing a lot right now with $65 billion coming down the pipes, right? Is big telco bypassing federal government lobbying, going to states and going directly to communities and saying, here's a briefing book, let us handle it, we got you, right? How do we make sure, not how to, it is our responsibility to make sure that our communities are well equipped to have those conversations, to understand their own digital needs, right? It may not be fiber, right? We want to get fiber as deep into this country as possible. That's going to enable fiber-filled fixed wireless. I was just reading that FWA seems like it might be a cheaper option. I don't have a lot of faith in 5G, but it's going to do that stuff too. But we need to make sure that communities are making the right decisions for themselves, which means we need to make sure that they have the right amount of information. And this goes back again to the political economy of our current situation, where the system is designed to actively exclude local communities, right? The way that policy is written is not for everyday people. We don't have an example, for instance, in Britain, they have the Lay Law Act, right, which says that every law that is passed has to have a lay version of it, right? So it's incumbent upon us, I think, to be a lot of times those translators, right? And to be trusted sources of information. And here's an example. I got a call, this is a couple years ago, from a county that will be nameless, and says, a consultant has offered us, for the cost of $100,000, a grant to work with us. $100,000, and they're like, is that a good deal? No. I'll do it for $5,000 and a ham sandwich, right? But I appreciate that that we built those relationships that they could call me and say, "Is this good?" Right? And I'm seeing this happen a lot now with these kind of predatory consultants. Again, feeding into the colossal amount of resource distribution that's about to happen. So that's kind of my one thing is the empowerment of local communities. And to the second point, which was about connectivity plus everything else, I think this is a difficult part that we have fetishized connectivity, right? So much money has gone to getting pipes in the ground. We have not thought nearly enough about affordability. I mean, the fact that we're going to let ACP expire in a year is criminal. But the challenge then for all of us is that this all has to happen simultaneously, right? Connectivity, affordability, skills, resources, tech support, hardware, and not just good enough of any of this, right? But great and to the needs of communities. That's the challenge for us, and that's something I'm seeing that we're not, at a federal policy level, we're certainly not talking about that. So one of the things I'm going to be following very closely is, every state has to produce a digital equity plan. Like, what are those equity plans actually going to be doing? Because by law, they have to consult local communities. I'm not seeing a lot of that happen right now. So again, feeding into this larger system, and I'm struck by something, Sascha, that you said, like the digital divide is getting worse. I've often made an argument that the digital divide is actually chronic because this is entirely about inequality. So saying that ending the digital divide will end equality is a BS argument. But these are, I think, our two contemporary challenges, is empowering communities to make the right digital choices for them, and then also making sure that we are focusing on a kind of a multimodal approach to digital everything. And this is the challenge, and this is why we need to be talking about this in spaces like this, and then to bring these conversations back to our own communities.
I don't want to add something really briefly. Do you want to jump in first? A direct response to one thing he just said.
No, go ahead.
Just really quickly on the empowering of communities, there is one thing that I think is actually, that freaks me out a little bit, which is that mostly the provision of digital inclusion is done in a direct service model, in a way that it's like if I want to have a rent control law, I am not going to be like, let's give a lot of money and a lot of attention to the welfare kind of landlord motherfuckers who are out there building developments in Brewery Town, So I think that we do lack a really critical power analysis, and honestly, a lot of the funding of how communities can build their own power map, their own power analysis about why they give a shit about internet and its provision, and why they give a shit about the infrastructure around it, has been divorced from this organizing for a really long time. And I do remember it, and I did come from it. And so I just want to mark that, and that anyone who's funding in and around the community provision of building one's own analysis from a community perspective of what we want out of our internet needs to have some patience and some humility and some long-term theorization about how does the provision of internet relate to the positive vision, often the abolitionist vision of the world that they want. And you can't speed that shit up. And you know that if that's who you're working with. And so I just wanted to lay that out. I'm sorry to jump in.
No, I was actually going to make that point too, that a lot of the digital inclusion activity that gets supported is very much didactic. It's very much with the presumption that people need to be brought on without a lot of thought. I'll talk to digital navigators who'll be like, oh, they're older and they don't understand. They're worried about their security and privacy. I'm well, yeah, they should be. So perhaps they know more than you do on this matter. There is a provision to speak to, so I don't have a great answer to your question, but just that I am also asking the same question. There is a division amongst the policy world between those who work on trying to hold tech oligarchs to account. So there's a group of nonprofits and think tanks that do that work, and then there's those of us that work on access, and never the twain shall meet. There isn't a lot of collaboration happening across, and that's something that we're at Benton trying to work towards right now. There is one teeny tiny provision in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act around making sure there's new and marginal users coming onto the internet know about cybersecurity and privacy. It's super vague language. So we're starting from that. Okay, so what does that mean? What do states need to think about? How can you use that provision to make it something more meaningful that is actually beneficial to people's lives? There's also a little bit of like, a lot of the broadband community pushed for this investment for a really long time. So there is a moment of celebration and a moment of like, okay, it's obviously not at all enough for the challenge, but it is a significant investment. And there is some hesitance to critique the thing that we're trying to build towards. So there is some broadband boosterism that happens that is a little bit harder for our community to challenge directly. So, which is why I think like the coalition building gets really critical, that we're hoping to do more of.
If I could just add, I'm always very wary of euphemisms, and access to me is like it's like, every high school in America has access to a UPenn Ivy League education, right? Every kid born in America has access to an 80-year lifespan. I'm like, well, that doesn't really tell me anything useful. I'm far more interested in actual adoption rates because they tell me something in a way that, but if you look universally, 100% of our federal mapping efforts are all about access. And that is very purposeful. It's to hide the discriminatory practices. It's to hide the injustices. It's to hide the price gouging. It's to hide all of the malfeasance. And there are few places I feel like we've been so systematic in maintaining that than the media and communications. And there's a reason for that, which is, she who controls the narrative. And so I kind of feel that this is part and parcel of a moment in our history, right, akin to the industrial or the agrarian revolution, where we've got the new robber barons, right? We all know who they are. And we've got the new oppressive systems. And I would say, yes, the access the access on the adoption is one part of it. I actually, on a day-to-day basis, spend equitable time fighting on the civil liberties privacy side of the equation. And that is a huge Gordian knot that we've created for ourselves and a disaster, especially for the exact same kind of constituents that I worry about in all these other domains. So yeah, this is different facets of, I think, the same really oppressive, terrible, egregiously bad puzzle. And, the best I can say about folks in DC is they are unbelievably technologically naive. That's the best it gets. And then it just goes downhill from there. So that's, to me, the challenge before us. It's grand. I think it's winnable, if no other reason than, mortality rates are holding steady at 100%. So eventually you get new leadership in there. But that, of course, is an opportunity that guarantees us nothing without organizing.
Okay, I believe we're at time, and I don't want to cut into lunch too much. So I'm sure there are more questions, and I'm sure everyone's happy to answer those. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. This was a fantastic conversation.